Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Rachel Ziemba, founder of Ziemba Insights and adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security. That in itself is a very interesting name of organization these days. Matthew Wright, senior freight analyst at Kipler, and Abha Gandhi joining us for the first time today, senior pricing analyst at General Index. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Matt, let me start with you and let's talk all things freight, because of course that's sort of one of the things that's top of mind in these oil markets these days: Red Sea disruptions, redirection of flows, and all the costs related to that. Are we seeing the market getting more at ease with this new normal? Again, another challenge, or is there uncertainty going forward?
Good morning. Thanks very much. I think it's actually a bit of both. I think you're absolutely right. There is definitely now the market has sort of reached a point of stability with transits down but holding. So just to give some context, tanker transits are down around 44% since November. So there's about 12 a day passing through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So this is definitely a lot lower than where we were in November, but it's not necessarily getting worse and it's not necessarily getting better. So the market is now sort of baking this in and essentially looking forward to the rest of the year and assuming this is going to be in place for a couple of months at least. I think Maersk came out earlier this week and said, look, we should expect this now through to the second half of the year. And I think that's definitely our assumption as well. There doesn't look to be any change in that. All it takes is for one or two ships to be attacked or attempts on vessels once a week or even less. And that is enough to keep owners away from the area and to keep insurance premiums high. So yeah, I think absolutely the market is sort of assuming this is going to come into place. And as a result, we're now seeing changes in trade flows become a bit more permanent. Obviously, it's still very early days, and we've got a lot of seasonality of the year to go through to see how these flows are going to develop. But for now, I think we should assume transits are going to remain constrained.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Rachel, welcome again. Let me go to you and let's stick to the freight story and but ask you about the recent U.S. sort of new layer of sanctions. They're getting tougher on Russian fleets. Maybe that hasn't kicked in yet, but we are hearing from some of our India-based specialists that yes, it's already affecting flows to there, for example, of Russian oil. I mean, has the U.S. made the right decision to squeeze those fleets at this very tricky time, obviously, for freight in general? And is it going to make that difference to obviously impacting Russia as opposed to the other fallout that we could see in general for costs and on oil flows?
Sure. Well, we'll see ultimately if that was the right time. I think we can, if we go back to over the last couple of months when I was with you guys in Fujairah, at that point we were sort of in a period of almost non-enforcement, both of Russia sanctions or at least oils, the oil price cap and the Iran, and on Iran's fleet, the sort of dark fleet that serves Iran and Venezuela. And since then, I think we've had a palpable shift. That being said, there's still plenty of Russian, barrels that are sort of getting to market. But it does seem like the discount has opened up, the costs have increased. Matt can tell us even more about this, but of course, Russian oil tankers are among those ones that are still going through, the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Any European flagged carriers, if anything, are more susceptible both to physical risk, but also the insurance premium. And I'll note even the fertilizer ship that was targeted earlier in the week, which was British flagged. So I think but ultimately, I think we saw over the last couple of days, the end of last week, not only additional Russian tankers violating the price cap targeted, but also subconflict. right? The big sort of ultimate owner of most of these vessels. Now that was undercut by a general license that said any tankers that haven't already violated sanctions, go ahead, do business with them. But I think if anything, this means that the fleet that is going to serve Russia will be it will be harder for tankers to go back and forth between sort of legal trade and less legal trade. And so that probably will tighten the market. And it will sort of make it more difficult. We're seeing India and China both say, we're willing to take this semi-illicit crude, but if your tanker has actually been sanctioned, we don't want this in our ports. So I think this does cause some issues and frictions. The fact that it's happening at a time that the market is generally well supplied, and as I would agree with Matt, that the market has settled into some of these disruptions, maybe makes it less disruptive than it would have otherwise. But this is a market tightening environment, and I think it will cut Russian oil revenues, but they may actually, those operating the ships will of course charge more. So it's an open question to me how much it will negatively impact the Russian, sort of war machine. And that's where I think the other sanctions will come into play. But the point for any operators right now is that there's a lot more paperwork. They have to attest every voyage, and that's going to cause some frictions.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Abha, I mean, the same kind of question to you. Obviously, you're focusing a lot on the Mideast crudes to Asia, presumably, mostly. Give us your take on how this sort of vessel disruption, redirection costs are, if at all, impacting Mideast crudes to Asia or anywhere else.
Thanks, Diala, for that question. And I think the panelists have, to a large extent, even sort of answered that question. But to add a further perspective, I think what we're seeing currently right now is a lot of, I think, a little bit of change in trade flow. So, for instance, prior to the whole Red Sea crisis, we were seeing the Middle East crude go significantly into Europe without much disruptions, especially the medium sours. But of course, that has now, come off as well, and has come off significantly. And that can even be seen in the Brent-Dubai spreads, right? So end of last year, for example, at one point, Dubai was briefly sitting above Brent, but then that has now changed. And today, the Brent-Dubai spread is trending at about, $2 a barrel. Despite the OPEC cuts, right? So having said that, of course, the flows have slowed down. And what has resulted is that you have all this sour crude now sitting in Asia as well, right? And not to forget, with the fundamentals, we are also heading into a refinery maintenance season. We are heading into spring. So there is this whole trade flow disruption of especially the Middle East crude as well.
And Abha, I know we don't have any official stats from China, but what indicators are you getting of how full their storage is at the moment? Obviously they stock up when prices are good. Prices have been relatively okay. Where are the indications there that you're getting?
So I think at this point for China, they're just coming back from the Lunar New Year holidays. There is an expectation that the domestic consumption of their refined products, whether it's gas, oil, gasoline, should have been slightly better. So we should be seeing them maybe perhaps come in the market. But at this point, I really haven't seen too much activity on their front. Maybe Matt can add further insights, but yeah.
Okay, thanks, Abha. Matt, I wanted to ask you about one of the news headlines we have on our bulletin today is about Russia's announcement of banning gasoline, and for domestic reasons they're citing, i.e. we need it more for the refineries because we've got maintenance coming, we need the storage, the stock that we have, etc. It's not so much, we're out to make things hard for the rest of the world, but what impact do we expect to see on products because of that, if at all?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a huge impact. Russian gasoline exports don't make up a huge component of their product export slate, majority being diesel, gas oil, naphtha. But I think, pardon me, I think the fact that they're announcing this shows their concern around serving the domestic market, that is potentially tight, and it's very, very important that they protect that. I think also when you take into account the number of drone strikes we've had through this year on refineries in Russia, that we're expecting that this is definitely going to be impacting refinery output reducing gasoline production. So that is it's all folding into that situation. We're expecting Russian product exports to drop, but this is, as I said, mainly going to impact naphtha into Asia, which is already having troubles getting there because, Black Sea to Asia is now a very, very long voyage. It makes a lot more sense just to take a Mideast Gulf cargo. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to it than, while gasoline exports itself is not going to be hugely impacted, it tells you a lot more about what's going on in Russia.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Rachel, I wanted to talk to you about one of the headlines again today, which is OPEC Plus. We always have to mention them at least once on every call. It's kind of hinting that, yes, they're mulling extending ththese voluntary cuts till June, which the market has already, I think, priced in from what we hear. But what about beyond that? There's some sources there citing that it could go beyond. Are we just still expecting a step by step from them? Do you think is that what the market should be sort of holding out for, or do they have? And with these geopolitical sort of turmoil that we're seeing, do we expect any different take from them?
So I think we'd need the geopolitical turmoil to turn into actual barrels lost. Right. So I think if there were actual barrels lost, of course, Saudi Arabia in particular and others would be quite ready to sort of add, if you had a price move up and actual loss. So I think we would need that sort of conversion. And, we've seen, that, in some ways, I agree with everything Matt just said about Russia's domestic reasons for their announcement. But of course, it also helps that in a broader context of meeting their OPEC Plus requirements, that Russia has often been a little less than compliant, or the opacity of data has made it harder to sort of determine what they're actually doing. So my assumption for some time has been that, yes, definitely sort of roll into the sort of mid-year and sort of into the second half. I think it really depends on, what goes on in sort of Chinese demand, which, some indicators show it's stabilizing and that some inventories are being drawn down. But I'm not too optimistic it will sort of pick up that much further. And then, of course, what happens with supply in the Americas, right? The non-OPEC supply. But yes, I do think in this environment where some major economies and global economy are sort of slowing down, where in those sort of contexts that OPEC Plus is unlikely to be able to bring a lot of new supplies to the market. But yeah, it's really I think about those macro factors and whether in sort of a regionalization of the conflict, does it actually impact Iranian supplies either on a sort of sanctions enforcement side, or is there sort of an impact to sort of the Gulf supplies? And I think to get a real move up, then I think you would need to see broadening there. And so that's not in the baseline, but this is already a tight market this is a tightening market. That was what OPEC Plus was trying to do. And so they'll be watching. And so they're doing this thing right now of trying to do forward guidance. But they haven't maybe, sort of quite figured out how to do that forward guidance. And so I think that takes us well towards the end of the year.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Abha, OPEC, the other thing that OPEC are planning to do officially in June at their official meeting, of course, they can take a lot of decisions before that remotely, is talk about these quotas, going forward, and we'll probably see some changes there formally put into place. What are your expectations that they will do there in terms of the other crude that's being produced within the group? Obviously, you're following Mideast crudes, but what impact could we see from the likes of Nigerian crude, etc., and even Venezuelan crude?
I think at this point it's a bit early to say how they would reshuffle, because we also need to see how much the group has actually produced. The latest numbers are still to come out, so we're waiting to see that, and that sort of gives us a direction as well. I think on Venezuela crude, what is very important to keep in mind is that the 6 months of the sanction relief is also sort of coming to an end. We are yet to hear on what exactly is going to happen on that front as well. Is the sanction relief going to continue? It's not going to continue. So I think there are a lot of these geopolitical factors that are still in play. till June, right? So for now, yes, as the panelists have also said, we are seeing that the ongoing cuts are sort of being extended until the first half of this year. So we have to wait and see a little bit longer to understand what the wider impact is going to look like as well. Yeah.
Matt, what about LNG? We saw obviously quite a bit of that go to Europe last year when it had a gas crisis, and we don't see that this year, obviously, in terms of prices or even availability. But again, LNG also being impacted through Suez. So any nervousness there? Prices are quite very competitive at the moment in terms of low and not very costly. So how are sort of stakeholders sort of looking at that market?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the situation in the Red Sea, LNG has been relatively unscathed in the fact that it's just really Qatar to Europe flows that have been affected, which are important. Flows are down to, I think this month they're about 570 KT, which is down quite significantly on where the average per month. Whereas when you look at the more, other flows, so Qatar East or US Europe or US East, so even US East, it's marginally faster to go through the Suez Canal, but it's not that bad to go around the Cape. So generally speaking, LNG flows have sort of shrugged this one off. And actually, when you look at LNG freight, it's actually been falling during this period. And that's just because of the wider context of what's happening with the LNG freight market. As you mentioned, the fact that we've not had a particularly cold winter in Europe, and Europe has not been having to battle with Asia to the same extent. So we're not seeing that fleet stretch. So while it's certainly had an impact, and those Qatar cargoes are being impacted, and I mean, we looked at the data recently, and there's been 0 transits of LNG cargoes through the Red Sea for weeks now. So yeah, it's definitely an impact, but the market seems to be coping.
Okay, thanks, Matt. There's our survey question for today. Are oil markets now factoring in Red Sea disruptions and costs for the entire year? That Maersk, as you said, Maersk had mentioned that as a sort of warning shot, if that might be the case. Yes or no, there's a belief that the Mideast crisis will be resolved, by June. Rachel, let me go to you on and about the Mideast crisis. Well, first of all, to get your point of view on where, from a US perspective, where things are going. We've got headlines every day that there are talks going on amongst all the involved parties. We see this as stalling when we're sitting here in the Middle East, more of the same. But from a US perspective, what are the expectations? Obviously, it's an election year. Biden has an interest to do X, Y, Z. Are you hopeful that we will see a permanent ceasefire and the US backing that eventually, or what?
I mean, I'd like to see that. I hope that I think that they are sort of pushing for that. There's been a lot of talk, as you say, ceasefire might be imminent. I'm personally not too optimistic that if something was announced now that it would hold. Right. So I guess the answer to your question is no. And just because I think that the perspectives, I think the Israelis are not quite ready to sort of end this opportunity, and the US, for all that they are sort of publicly, sort of critiquing. There's also, I think, a dynamic, and you see this with other foreign issues, of to what extent are certain foreign players sort of trying to wait and see who the next president is going to be, right? Is it going to be another Biden administration, or will it be Trump, which is, and a Trump administration would probably be preferred by the Israelis. It's not clear to me exactly where, a Trump administration would come in, with a changed Middle East, not only because of the conflict, but with this persistent Saudi-Iran détente that has been in play, which has been, I think, one of the important reasons that has limited some of the energy infrastructure damage, right? We're not seeing Houthi attacks on Saudi or Emirati infrastructure, which we might have had. I mean, again, there's too many what ifs in that scenario is about to sort of paint. So look, I think, it's not... it's hard to put a timeline on when this sort of comes to play, or what that looks like. But I think in a similar way to what Matt said at the start, that the oil market has sort of settled into these disruptions. I think that certain regional players, even though they're very much pushing for, that there's still things that can pop up, but the general thing is trying to avoid further regionalization.
Yeah, and I mean, just to stay with you, Rachel, on let's bring China into that question, because
Sure.
it did come out quite strongly a week or so ago, criticizing what Israel's doing in Gaza, and sort of vocally expressing quite specifics. And before this conflict, it was being seen, or at the start of it, being seen as a possible mediator, etc. Where does China, what's the US perspective on China's role in getting involved in balancing things in the Middle East? Behind the scenes, do you think, could there be something going on? And what do you think is viable?
Yeah, so I think the US would like to see China getting more involved in mediating and as a peacemaker, but of course they'd like to China do it in the way that the US would have done it, yeah. Right? I mean, which never sort of works as well as one thinks. China, obviously, as the biggest trading nation, has an interest in trade flows going as quickly and sort of cheaply as possible. I mean, of course, that's arguably a global public good. And so they have an interest. Now, they also, and they don't have the same baggage that the US does in the region, but they all, and they're the biggest buyer, but of the crude, but there's still a limitation of how far China's willing to go in negotiating. Look, the US and China are still on their talk more, try to avoid escalation of tensions. That I think is being challenged not only by conflict in the Middle East, but also the sort of sanctions on Russian entities that are China based. And I think this is also coming at a time when China-EU relations have been deteriorating, especially on the trade side. And we saw very harsh words from China about the European Union sanctions on their admittedly very small companies or smaller companies that are supplying Russia. So I do think the diplomatic efforts are arguably sort of impaired by these other tensions. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of global interest in trying to de-escalate and stop this brutal war. It's just not clear to me exactly how far China will be able to go in that.
Yeah, and of course, there's the theory out there that part of the incentive behind this war is that the US does want to get back involved in the maritime area of the Middle East because of China, and because to sort of act it as a sort of balancing out to China's dominance elsewhere. Matt, let me go to you. I'm not sure if you can give me precise details on this, but last year we talked a lot about Iranian crude increasing. They had a really good improvement on the water. Give us what indicators you're getting about Iranian crude on the water. We don't seem to be hearing about it a lot, particularly about it being sanctioned more strictly, practically speaking. What indicators are you getting there?
Yeah. I literally just having a look while we're on the call just to see what the latest is. So in February, exports are down slightly at about 1.1 million barrels a day. This is compared with November, where we were about closer to 1.5. So it's definitely down. I think a lot of this is just to do with Chinese buying. China's the only customer, really. And Chinese total exports to China over the last few months have been around 9.4. Sorry, exports to, not imports. So I would say partly a lot of it's linked to that. In terms of sanctioned vessels and their availability, there's been the fact that we've now sanctions on Venezuela have been lifted. So a lot of those vessels they have now sort of stopped doing Venezuelan trade and are sort of moving back. So there's more ships really in the market to keep those Iranian cargoes moving. So that's not a restraint at the moment. And in the broader context, it's still well within the normal range of Iranian exports. Okay,
and on the Venezuelan crude, I know that's not specifically your expertise, but is the market expecting a renewal of? I mean, I should ask Rachel this, but I'll ask you. You've probably got more data on that. Are we expecting a rollover of the 6-month reprieve? Is that in the US's interest, do you think, from a crude pricing point of view?
Yeah, and I'll let Rachel weigh in a bit, but I think it is, and for a couple of reasons. One, though, that crude is incredibly useful for U.S. Gulf refineries. It's heavy sours. We've also got the startup of Mexican refinery later this year, Dos Bocas, which is going to reduce heavy sours into the US further. So the US is going to be really looking around to get those sour grades into the Gulf, and Venezuela provides a really good flow of that. So there's a good few reasons why they'll want to maintain that.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Abha, actually, I'll just go to you. Whereas we're talking about refining, in terms of how it might be impacting Mideast crudes as well and production. We've got, of course, Kuwait has the largest refinery, I believe, in the region, El Zor, which is now in full capacity, up and running, or at least soon to be. How is that impacting production, I suppose, in Kuwait itself, possibly, and also in terms of the export scenario from that refinery into the region and how that might be impacting other flows?
So I think on Kuwait, yes, I think they have fully started, but a lot of focus has been on their VLSFO exports for the longest time on product front as well. And it was, largely done because they're still not in the summer season, and and so domestic consumption is yet to still pick up. But I think because they have started but not fully started, I think this summer will actually be a real test to see where those product flows are going to look like. And it's not just with Al Zur, right? You've got Oman's Duqm also that has sort of started. So you have a lot of these Ruwais, for example, Abu Dhabi, the refineries also starting, coming out of maintenance. So I think we will see a couple of these things, but it will probably unfold a little bit more as we head into the summer months to really see what the flows look like at this point of time.
Okay, and Abha, could you give us an update on what you're hearing about on the crude side? Iraqi production, Libyan, we've had stops and starts there. There was some positive optimism that Iraqi crude would be back, exports would be back, sort of a bit more back in action at the start of this year. Any updates there and indications?
So I think with Libya, there was the whole Sahara oil field issue earlier part of the year that has been resolved. So I think once we see the OPEC numbers coming out, perhaps the expectation might be that might be a little bit on the higher side, yes. There was a minor disruption, a brief disruption of the Wafa oil field as well. So I don't think that's really impacted the market as much. I haven't looked at Iraq, to be very honest, but I haven't heard anything otherwise.
Okay, thanks. Rachel, I did want to go back to you about that Venezuelan crude question. And, do you expect that we'd see a renewal of that 6-month reprieve? And what indicators are you getting that is giving confidence to companies to get more involved than they already have done?
Yeah, so I think short answer is I don't think right now that it's going to be renewed. I think there'll be a certain baseline. I mean, Matt's completely right. It is beneficial for the U.S. energy ecosystem. But I do think that in a sense, the politics, not only the election, but also having explicitly tied the reprieve to political concessions, make it hard to back away and so on. And beyond the energy market issues that Matt brought up, arguably non-renewal would, make the sort of migration crisis even more difficult to sort of, handle, perhaps. That's a topic for another day. We're seeing Maduro sort of act tough not only with Guyana and try to put some of that at risk, but also not accepting back in the sort of deported migrants. This is a big political issue in the United States. So now then the question is, if the reprieve is not renewed, do you go back to the baseline of October, or do you sort of, does that impair some of the swaps that were going on that Chevron and others are able to take advantage of? But what seems from the market perspective, I think if anything, there does seem to be a bit of a wait and see. Appa and Matt talked about China's price competitiveness vis-a-vis Iran. I think there's some evidence of that in Venezuela as well. Are Chinese buyers waiting to sort of see whether they'll be able to get bigger discounts? Whereas now Venezuela is been selling to India, they've been selling to others, you know, and it's different tankers that are, you know, able now to carry Venezuelan crude. After April, that may not be the case. And so I think what the market's waiting for also is signals of what the sort of wind down period might look like. And like, but, you know, I think it's notable to say that from a perspective, players that were already active in Venezuela, like Chevron and so on, have obviously kind of solidified their position. But new players coming in to actually invest, they've been sort of wary because the worry was the door could be closed again. And that's probably been warranted.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe we won't get clarity on that till after the election, as you said, with so many questions for the energy sector there in the US. Thank you so much to Abha, Rachel, and Matt for joining us. There's the result of our survey. It's quite tight, 56% saying yes, we've factored in that it's probably going to continue for the remainder of the year, possibly. And we have our halftime talk, just to show you everyone, with the DME coming up in an hour or so. Worthwhile interview to watch there. Great insight there from Russell Robertson on sort of the changing flows of trade in terms of the benchmarks, etc., that we're seeing in the region, and what expectations are, including the stake that was bought by Saudi Tadawul on DME. So it's quite interesting there to see his perspective on what new products are expected to come out of the region there on the exchanges. So thanks so much for joining us, everybody, and have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kiala. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Yeah, thank you all.